if you've got members of the public and all that, but we just wouldn't have sufficiency for a official action of the committee.
Sure.
Can they give direction?
Sure.
Okay. And Chair, it looks like we have a quorum.
All right, wonderful. So I'd like to call this meeting to order, the special meeting of the CalChoice Financial Reserve Policy Ad Hoc Subcommittee. Roll call, please, Board Secretary.
Thank you. City of Lancaster,
Here.
City of Palmdale,
Here.
City of Pico Rivera.
Here.
Excuse me, City of Pomona.
Chris Diggs here.
Thank you. We have a quorum.
All right, wonderful. We'll ask the Board Secretary to provide the public comment announcement.
Thank you. Members of the public can address the subcommittee on the agenda item during public comment period. Speakers are limited to 3 minutes each in conformance with the Brown Act. No board action can occur on items presented during public comment. If you desire to speak during public comment and are in person, please fill out a speaker card and submit it to CalChoice staff. If you are participating in a remote location, please identify yourself with a CalChoice representative. When you're called to speak, please come forward to the podium and state your name. Thank you.
Are there any speaker cards remotely?
No one from the public in Pomona.
Pico?
None.
All right, well, that takes us to item number 1 to discuss and provide input into California Choice Energy Authority Financial Reserve Policy. And the staff report will be presented by Treasurer Barbara Boswell.
Thank you, Chair Harris. This subcommittee was formed at the request of the board in May at the regular board meeting. When the board adopted the budget, a question came up with regards to the California Choice Energy Authority, or CalChoice, Financial Reserve Policy. And during that meeting, it was requested that a subcommittee be formed to develop a policy to be brought back to the full board for consideration. This is the first meeting of the subcommittee, and I do have a slide deck. And the goal of today's meeting is to gather input from the subcommittee sufficient to draft a policy, and then have one more subcommittee meeting for the subcommittee to consider a draft policy that then will come back to the full board. And I will share my screen for a PowerPoint presentation. Just for some background, prior to the change in board structure that we currently have, which consists of an appointee, a city manager appointee from each of our 8-member agencies, CalChoice was a component unit of City of Lancaster. And as such, we followed City of Lancaster policies, financial policies for the management of CalChoice. And that policy we've been following since that time. Now that we're looking at developing our own reserve policy, some considerations for the board to think about in providing input and helping to craft the draft policy include maintaining financial stability of CalChoice, providing operational efficiencies for the members, including the ability for CalChoice to assist with energy transactions, and then so making payments in advance and then billing the member agency afterwards, cash requirements of CalChoice in order to enable that type of arrangement between CalChoice and the member agencies, and also think about future CalChoice member transactions opportunities, such as potentially CalChoice pursuing a credit rating that would enable us to potentially do some financings that would allow for prepays and maybe save our member agencies in their energy costs. In thinking about the various reserve categories that we may want to consider, what I've thought about and proposed is maybe having two distinct categories within our reserve policy, including an operational reserve and a working capital reserve. And of course, this is by no means meant to be, this is just a starting point for consideration and discussion. The operational reserve would be to provide for unexpected expenses of CalChoice, to meet days liquidity on hand metrics that would be considered best practices. And so looking at that, maybe 6 to 9 months of our operating expenses, or 50 to 75% of our budgeted expenditures. And then have a separate working capital reserve. That working capital reserve would provide the operational effectiveness, so provide funds for energy supply transactions that are paid for on behalf of the member agencies, and then reimbursed through the monthly administrative services invoice. And that in thinking about what level should that be, basing it on the prior year's energy supply expenditures and projected cash flow needs. So we did take a look at what last year looked like in terms of the cash flow related to energy transactions. And CalChoice, the largest energy purchase that was made through CalChoice was $7.75 million. The average monthly was $3.5 million. So that gives you some level of, what our cash flows for last year look like related to those types of transactions. That completes the presentation. So I will stop sharing and turn it back over to you, Chair Harris, and I'm happy to answer any questions that the board may have. Or the committee may have, sorry, subcommittee may have.
Right. Thank you. I do recall us putting the subcommittee together. Could you just remind us real quick, Barbara, if you have it on hand, what is the current level of reserves? How much are your reserves now?
Yes, one moment.
And while you're doing that, just kind of reminded to also attach to the staff report is the City of Lancaster's reserve policy. And I put this together for the city probably about 4 years ago, understanding that reserves are like a double-edged sword. It's great to have them when you need them, but when you have them and people seemingly don't believe you need them, they think that's money that should be spent. and there's money just sitting idle that should be going into programs and projects and all those other wonderful things. And so it was thoughtful that we here at Lancaster that we actually added some definition to our policy and actually added the various layers to the policy to really truly justify 40% instead of just saying 40%. And eventually that may be where you target, like we use the justifications to come up with a percentage that's appropriate, that we just manage to as revenues and expenditures change throughout the years. But shooting for a target is always good. Understanding that once, like what we experienced this year, probably both the cities of Palmdale and Lancaster, as we added $20 million to $21 million in revenue, that actually sparked an additional $8 million that was required to meet the reserve policy. And so I think we should come up with a policy that has an initial percentage amount with some structure to it without necessarily getting caught in that with every new dollar, 40% needs to go into reserves, because then you do get run into the issue of having so many reserves that people are starting to question how much you have in reserves. But I think the two layers that you propose is a good start. For the working capital layer, what we did here is we really just looked at the 12-month cycle of ins and outs into our general fund and figured out what was the peak month. So that had the greatest spread between revenues and expenditures, and it's generally the between now and January, because we don't get our large property tax receipts until January. And so with expenditures being pretty regular with payroll, and only getting revenues certain times of the year, there's certain times of the year where we have to actually dip into what we define as our working capital to pay bills until the revenues come in. The revenue structure for CalChoice is different than that. So we all make and I believe we all make our payments on a regular basis to match the expenditures, not in one huge lump sums. So then we would be looking at what are the non-payroll expenditures and how do they spike? And so I think the analysis that you performed on the power purchases is appropriate to try to come up with when are those likely and what is the variance of the revenues and the expenditures during those periods that need to be made up with if transactions need to be made with some urgency to purchase power. And so I think that that's a great start. The other layer, the emergency reserves, we really want to start thinking about what would be an emergency. I know for our general fund, an emergency is defined completely different. We can have Costco close or a couple dealerships go out of business, and that'll affect the city significantly differently than how CalChoice is funded. So we really want to start thinking about, so what are we're going to do kind of a SWOT analysis. What are the threats to the revenues to CalChoice? And then how can we mitigate against those? And so then we're looking at the ability of each CCA's ability, to make those regular payments. And what drives that are, customers paying our bills to be able to provide us the revenue to make the payment to you. And so how do we kind of take a look, maybe a 12-month look back and on trending to see what's a potential threat that could impact those revenues or the ability for those. So then we start looking at what if 2 agencies have trouble and cannot pay, and then maybe come up with the metrics. So what if, and I don't want to why don't we use agencies that aren't here so I don't offend anybody? What if San Jacinto's here? If San Jacinto had an inability to make their payment for the quarter, what in let's say San Jacinto and Palm Desert, because they're relatively local to one another. I'm sorry, Rancho Mirage. If they can't make their payment, what is the impact to revenues? And maybe we start thinking about that as kind of the metric to use to kind of forecast what the reserve for that layer should be. And then the third layer I would say would be kind of the energy purchases. So what is the working capital? So you have working capital just to meet cash flows. Then you have your emergency reserves as an analysis based on one or two of the agency's inability to pay for a quarter or inability to pay for 6 months' time, something along those lines. And then what do we need on hand to really front load or cash flow energy purchases before the money is received individually after the price is all determined and then invoices go out for everybody to pay. So I would recommend 3 layers, but I'm open to conversation for anybody else's input.
Yeah, and Chair, I do have that answer to your question about what our
Mhm.
current net positions are. Our projected net position as of June 30, 2025, and this is still preliminary pre-audit, is 1.8 million. So it's 67% of our current adopted 25-26 expenditures, which is 2.7 million. The 2.7 million is related to the CalChoice operations and not related to the energy transactions, since those are a flow pass-through.
Right.
So that's where we currently stand. That is different than what our cash balance is. From a cash perspective, you might recall that in the end of last calendar year, our scheduling coordinator, NRG, proposed to the member agencies to move away from the 60-day payment terms for the CAISO and energy payments to 2 options, either a 30-day deferred payment or a weekly payment. And
Mhm.
so there were a few of our member agencies that elected the weekly payment. And because we are only able to invoice and draw out of the member agencies' lock boxes once per month, those agencies that elected weekly provided to us an upfront cash deposit to provide the funding source to make those weekly payments. And the total of the advanced cash deposits was 6 million. So that is included in our current cash balance. So currently our cash balance is just over 7.5 million.
So I think the $6 million can be used to credit against the working capital.
So that $6 million is specific for each of the member agencies who elected the weekly CAISO payments to have the funding to make that, because those payments can range anywhere from, for an agency, if we have a really hot week, for example, and there's a lot of exposure, those invoices can be in the many millions of dollars. So those really need to be protected because those were made by those member agencies specifically for their weekly
No,
CAISO.
yeah, I understand. Okay. So so it's outside of CalChoice operations. It's specific for CAISO, for their individual obligations to CAISO or for those CAISO payments.
That's
Okay. So that is to be excluded. Now, we need to really then just isolate CalChoice expenditures, not specific CCA expenditures. And so I think we're looking at, I mean, and 67% reserves on the $2.7 million is pretty sizable. It's a pretty, I mean, you're doing better than what we're doing at our 40% for our general fund. Now, maybe it's just time to add some definition to the 1.8. Because I think it suffices, but then we do have to take a look at in the event where we have to collect cash in advance to sustain the power purchases, the lump sum power purchases that are being done. That should be a separate analysis and a separate reserve, similar to the $6 million as it's set up for those CAISO payments. Make sense?
Yes, correct. So that 1.8 million would be the source of the 3 different reserve types categories that you had.
Yeah, but I'm concerned about it not being sufficient enough to cover those power purchases.
Correct.
So should we be really looking at an additional similarly built reserve for those power purchases, which becomes, working capital for the CCAs in the event of a power purchase, not for the operations of CalChoice. And so maybe we need to start thinking about those as 2 different functions of the reserves and then really focus the $1.8 million on CalChoice and adding the definition. Maybe the definition is really then just your normal working capital analysis for CalChoice. And then the second layer being that of the emergency reserves, or in the event that any one of our agencies can't pay for a quarter. Really focusing on that for just CalChoice operations, and then similarly to how you did the $6 million, have another reserve that's set up for power purchases. Make sense?
Yeah, yes.
Sometimes I feel like I talk in circles.
You have a hand raised.
Yeah, this is Pete Rivera. We have a few questions.
Yeah,
Yes.
I have a question too.
Yes, go ahead.
Good morning. So this is the City of Pico Rivera. We just have a couple of thoughts to add to City of Lancaster and their analysis and thoughts about the reserve. So, we had the same thoughts to isolate just the CCA management, for lack of better words, the management arm and the management financials when we talk about the 67% reserve that we have as of June 30th, 2025. In terms of making purchases and actually having the cash flow and having cash flow, I don't know that Barbara ever said challenges, but if we were ever to have cash flow challenges, that is separate. That's kind of like a separate arm of the CalChoice financials than what we're talking about here. So if we're just sticking to the 67% and trying to assess whether the 67% is enough or is it too much, I want to just ask a few follow-up questions on the cash flows. And I know, Barbara, you mentioned that the average monthly cash balance is 3.5 million. Would you be able to know how low it's gotten?
Let me clarify those amounts. So we looked at how much was the largest outflow for energy transactions on behalf of our member agencies. And that was 7.75 million. The average monthly outflow is the 3.5 million. So that's
Okay,
the balance. That's the average amount going out.
okay, okay. And then separate from that, so if we're just trying to craft a policy pertaining to just the management structure and pulling out these power payments, would we be able to just craft like, you know, I'm talking old school GFOA risk-based reserve modeling to where we talk about an operating reserve and maybe if it's appropriate, a rate stabilization reserve, and try to, you know, put in a particular percentage to each. Fortunately, we don't have to worry about like a capital reserve because outside of your regular, you know, equipment, operations equipment, there's no capital that we can think of. And then lastly is the emergency. And that's the one that we think might also be worth looking into as you're talking about litigation or cybersecurity and trying to just balance it with, you know, the necessary insurance coverage. Obviously, we're all going to periodically suffer from some type of, you know, contingency, emergency, whatnot. Those also need to be factored in, but at what levels? And that's always tricky to put a percentage on it, especially right now with the cyber being such a, you know, hot topic around here and us really not knowing, not really if, but when we're going to get struck with a cyber incident. So those are just our thoughts. And then also, as we're talking about the emergency reserve, what would happen if, you know, there was litigation against the CCA by another member agency, and how big could that, you know, self-insurance retention be, or what would be like the likely maximum, I guess, that we could apply to this emergency reserve?
So the types of CalChoice enters into our transactions are generally energy transactions between CalChoice on behalf of its member agencies and an energy supplier. The risk to us is related to whether or not we pay those invoices. And the security for those invoices is the lockbox. And when the suppliers sell the energy, they agree that that's their first right and their first pathway to being made whole. I'm looking at Allison for assistance in terms of where we have potential risks, because I'm struggling to think about where our transactions are fairly limited and they're on behalf of our members.
Right.
And answer.
Right. Most of our big risks are allocated to each member.
There you go.
We could end up in a fight with one of our consultants about performance. I don't think that's terribly likely, but it could happen. We could, I don't see a lot of tort liability arising for us just by the nature of our operations, et cetera. I think the scope of the risk is pretty limited.
Right.
We're more of a
And if I-
paper organization than anything.
And I think everything would be spread, like in the event that, let's just say, we want to take up a legislative challenge to benefit the group as a whole. That would be a moment for us to pause and go and reach out to each CCA and do an assessment for those particular costs as opposed to building them into the reserves. But I'm trying to, and I can't figure out what CalChoice's litigation risk would be unless it's being challenged by one of its members.
This is Janelle, City of Palmdale. As it relates to the cyber risks or, those challenges that a member agency could bring against CalChoice, maybe I'm a little behind the curve here, but what is the amount of insurance that CalChoice has to cover such risks as well? I think we need to consider that as we look at what the potential reserves are needed in that area.
That is a good question. Barbara, is that something you can answer? With the coverage that we carry, is CalChoice protected from within kind of cyber risk protection?
I will pull up our current policy.
I believe we have cyber coverage.
Yeah.
I'm
Right.
pretty sure, and
Yeah,
if we don't, we need to get it.
yeah. And we also have very strong internal controls, and we actually just had our internal control interview with River City Bank. And so all of our transactions go through 3 levels of approvals, and included in those approvals is reviewing the banking information. And anytime we get a request from a supplier to change banking information, that banking information that's provided is verified independently. And we contact the bank directly, and we speak to the bank and reconfirm numbers. So we have built confident, and the bank agreed that our procedures are very strong in terms of protections for cyber security. And I'm sorry, Chris Diggs has had his hand up for quite some time, Chair.
Yes, go ahead. Is it Pomona? Yes.
Yes. I think some of the questions I think have already somewhat been discussed, but I definitely think that separating each of the CCA's reserves is probably a better way to go, at least from the perspective I have at the moment. The current reserve for CalChoice would likely be smaller. I mean, you've got 1.8 million, so you got 67%. Obviously that's a significant amount. But the power purchases, those are the liability of each one of the CCAs. And so having some type of a general fund, so to speak, that covers all of those expenses, I don't think that that's appropriate, that a CCA would have to somehow ensure that another CCA's cash is on hand in order to make those payments. Those are the responsibilities of each of the CCA. I wouldn't expect any other CCA to help ensure that payments for my power are made. So I think realistically, then the amount of the reserve is significantly smaller, knowing that the operations of CalChoice are not that significant financially. It's the power purchases, and those are the liability of each one of the CCAs themselves. And if we're interested in doing other projects, I don't know that anything was listed, but it was mentioned doing other projects, that a determination could be made at that time if we choose to, I'll just use the word assess ourselves for those projects. We can make that determination at that time, but having a reserve for that, I don't really know that that's necessary. And for Pomona, we also have our own reserve for the CCA. So if we start stacking on this reserve and your reserve, or double counting reserves, it can be pretty significant. And I don't know that that would be necessary. As was said, we're kind of a paper agency, so having all of this belt and suspenders approach, I don't really think that's too necessary.
Chair, if I can respond to Mr. Diggs with regards to his comments on
Yes, go ahead.
covering cash needs of the CCAs. The energy transactions that typically result in CalChoice paying for the invoices prior to being reimbursed by the CCAs are generally renewable energy transactions. And the CCA's funds are held in a lockbox and can only be pulled out on either the 23rd or the 25th of the month, depending on their security agreement. Frequently, the renewable energy transactions can be due on the 20th. And so if we did not have sufficient cash to pay those, we would have to reach out to the member agency, separate and apart from our normal invoicing process, ask them to transfer funds to us in order to be able to make that payment. And it could be, it's a process that I think would potentially be a bit cumbersome. And really, the funds are generally only needed for a couple of days, but they are needed. And it's one of the benefits that are provided to the member agencies. Of course,
But
we're happy.
No, I can understand you've got a float issue there and timing, but the cash balance now of 7.5 million, I think, you'd correct me if I'm wrong, for the most part is covering that. So enhancing any reserve beyond what we have as far as a cash balance and I don't know if we're calling it a reserve or not, that 167%.
Let me clarify, of the 7 million, 6.5 million
Yeah, it's for the weekly payments.
it's for the weekly payments that those member agencies who selected the weekly payments provided to us. We do not use those funds for renewable energy payments for another member agency
So
because
how are you covering the float now then?
from the 1,000,008 that we have
Oh,
roughly.
okay. So yeah, so you're making that work with what is had. So the cash balance that is
Well, yes and no, Chris, I'm sorry. There's been a couple occasions where the Lancaster CCC has fronted the cash and then got reimbursed.
okay. So I mean, if we need to enhance that so Lancaster doesn't have to do that, which, you know, if I were you, I don't know that I would want to do that. So if we have to somehow make that process a little more robust so that that's not taking place, I don't know that I would have a problem with that at all.
Yeah,
I do. Well, and maybe this whole conversation about the power purchases in aggregate by CalChoice is a different conversation. And I think I have some ideas on that too, where maybe an advance payment on a previous month's certificate could pre-fund the purchase of the renewable energy, so that the money is already paid in advance and deposited in advance and be ready for that payment. So that could be something that we can do if we know exactly what those costs are going to be. But I think going back to the reserve conversation, I think I tend to agree with everyone. 67% is a sizable reserve for the CalChoice operations. However, at that amount and at that volume, I think we need to add some definition to it. And so how do we define what are the components of that 67%? Is it 50% working capital, 17% emergency, or 30%? You know, so maybe adding a policy that adds some definition to that percentage or to that amount. Because what's going to happen, we have to have an amount that we manage the cash flows to, so that if there are any surplus funds, those surplus funds could be used to support the budget in the subsequent year, thus maybe reducing or stabilizing the rates that's being charged out to the agencies. And so maybe let's work on the 67, like the 1.8 million. Is that enough after we do the analysis on the emergency risk assessment and the working capital analysis, and see if that's sufficient or too much or whatever the case may be. And then let's have a separate conversation about how do we handle cash flow for those power purchases. And I think the easiest way is if we know we have X amount of cash or needed for a renewable energy purchase, say the middle of August, maybe a portion of that payment now appears on my July certificate. If that makes sense, Barbara.
I agree with that. If I can just jump in real quick. I agree with that, keeping those two separate. I think that will obviously make it easier. And I think that's what we're here to do, is on that, focusing on that 1.8 portion. So good comments.
We could just add something for the city of Pico Rivera. I think what we're hearing you say is that there could be potentially some cash flow timing issues because of just the payment structure between the 9 member cities. Is there, and I know that this is a separate conversation, but if it's a cash flow issue, not issue, but if it's a cash flow discussion, would it be appropriate to go back to assess just the payment structure and make that a different conversation than what the operating reserves are of management of CCA, and pull those apart to where, you're not having to float, and we're not even having that discussion, because just like what we hear you say, if there is a deposit already made to ensure that there are sufficient funds to cover the periodic payments, then that should be outside, or consider that being outside of this, just the reserves for the management, for
Yeah,
lack of better words.
yeah, I'll speak to a couple of points that have been raised. So there's been discussion about having an emergency reserve in the event that a member agency isn't able to make its monthly payments.
Mhm.
The agreements between CalChoice and the member agencies are such that CalChoice is a secured creditor in the lockbox. So CalChoice is paid for out of the funds in the lockbox, and we have first priority similar to the other energy suppliers. If there are not sufficient funds in the lockbox to pay CalChoice, that member agency has some pretty significant issues, because that means they aren't able to pay their suppliers. And we should know that pretty far in advance, because we do track financial metrics in terms of days cash on hand, days liquidity on hand. We have discussions with member agencies at the operational meetings about, their cash reserves and where they're at. So I don't see that as necessarily a high risk that we need to have substantial reserves to prevent, because the structure in the agreement between CalChoice and the member agencies protects us from that instance. And as long as the member agencies are getting rates appropriately, that's, I think, not a risk.
Okay.
With regards to renegotiating the payment terms that was brought up by Pico Rivera, those are established within the security agreement and the agreements between the associate members and CalChoice, and provides us protections with regards to being a creditor in the lockbox. One of the benefits of being a member of CalChoice is aggregating load and doing joint procurement. And there are times when we're going out and making those procurements and solicitations for supply, for example, resource adequacy or renewable energy, where the supplier is not comfortable with the lockbox, or doesn't want to be a party to the lockbox because it's a one-time transaction or something like that. And sometimes those payment terms are such, as I mentioned, that frequently the payments are due on the 20th. The member agency has sufficient funds in their lockbox. So if we look at doing something different, the member agencies have to be comfortable with us reaching out and them potentially having to send us money from other sources until they can get reimbursed from the lockbox. Historically, the member agencies have appreciated that we've had this flexibility to be able to have the short-term, meet those short-term cash flow needs. But the member agencies, some of them during periods of time have been a little more challenged. It's getting better. The accounts receivable issues or percentages of outstanding are getting better. Things are getting better, but we did go through some rough times there where, having this ability really helped our members, and that we feel that's one of the benefits and things that, we like to see happen to help make sure our member agencies are successful and don't have risks of not being able to meet their obligations.
Right. And so I guess, Barbara, maybe what we do is we offer the agencies options when those payments need to be made early. Maybe some may prefer that the certificate on the draw from the lockbox from the month prior, it would include an advance payment for their share of that bulk purchase. And or some of them may be willing to, and I know that we've done it historically, maybe just drawn from our other accounts to make the advance payment and then just reconcile it later. But I think I would be okay. Well, I think and also depends, it sounds like it depends on the supplier on whether or not they're happy getting their funds from the lockbox or from wherever, but maybe we could sort through that. But maybe it's just a way to where, because I know that we've had to, and I appreciate Chris saying that we've had to advance the funds on that short term and get reimbursed. And we have no issue doing it because we have never not gotten reimbursed. But maybe there's just a process change where they can elect if they want to send them funds from another source, they can do so, or they can elect to have the payment pulled from the months prior's lockbox certificate.
Yep, we could do that.
Okay. I think in any event, though, I think we've adequately added content that separates the two issues. So really focusing on the reserve, the 1.8 million, and kind of adding some construction to it, some structure to it. And then really coming up and using the science or using the math to determine if 1.8 is sufficient, or if 1.8, if we're going to draw the line at 1.8 based on the analysis, and then allowed to add to it up to another percentage that's more appropriate after you do your analysis. Or maybe after the analysis, we find that maybe the reserves should be 1.5, in which case there's surplus reserves that we need to, bring back to the board as to what to do with those. Well, go ahead, Janelle.
I'm sorry, can I just, a point of clarification? The 1.8 that you mentioned is the current net position, correct? Can you
Correct.
just clarify what is the current percentage basis that you're applying? Is it the 40%? It sounds like this percentage is higher. So how are you coming to this 1.8? It sounds like that is just your preliminary audited net position, but what percentage is being applied and how are we coming to this 1.8? That's first point of clarification. And then just so that I understand and summarize for myself, cash flow issue would be a separate issue we'll address in a future conversation. And then we're looking for operational risk analysis, a little more detail there. CalChoice specifically, because most member agencies do have their own individual policies. And then it sounds like the risk is minimal as it relates to member agencies not being able to pay CalChoice, and therefore, if I understood correctly, you'll be providing a little more detailed analysis relating to what that risk truly could be and maybe consider a very minimal reserve component for that. Did I cover everything?
You did. And I think I can answer your first question. There is no policy existing. That's why we're working on it.
So how was that 1.8?
So 1.8 is just compiled over the years. It's just built up over the years, and that's where it ended up. Yeah.
And I think my question originated from Barbara's presentation, in which she stated that CalChoice is applying Lancaster's policy. So there was a disconnect there for me.
And so I guess I can explain that. There is a disconnect. We did not have a reserve policy established for CalChoice. That's why we're taking up now. We had a reserve policy for Lancaster Energy, which is 25% of operations. And so that's why over time, the funds, because they didn't know, we really didn't have a policy on how to handle surplus funds at the end of the years. It's just the 1.8 is a compilation of multiple years of having excess funds at year end. And it's just now we're coming to the realization, well, what do we do with that? And that's why we're meeting, and that's why the subcommittee was formed, because we had 1.8, we just went through budget. There's an assessment, and none of us really we never discussed what the reserve requirement should be to see how much surplus funds can be applied to the budget.
Point of clarification, the 1.8 is CalChoice as a separate entity from Lancaster's
Correct.
reserve. Okay.
That is correct.
And then going back to Barbara's slides, I believe the proposal was 50 to 75% of operating expenditures. Do I remember that correctly? I guess what I'm looking for is just a little more detail as it relates to those operating expenditures and what that risk truly is, because 50 to 75% is a big spread. And what is the true necessary reserve?
Yeah. And
Yeah,
I think that that's what would follow this conversation is let's perform the analysis. Let's look at the cash flows outside of power purchases, because that's a different conversation. I think we all agree. And just look at how, I mean, there's other invoices that are charged directly to CalChoice on all of our behalves. And the revenues may or may not come in that same pace, right? And so is there working capital analysis that just says you have to have at least X amount of money on cash or cash on hand to be able to pay your bills on your monthly basis because you may only get revenues quarterly, right? Does it make sense? And so what do you have to fill in by the time you get to right before that third quarter of an assessment? How many bills do you have that must be paid in advance of that? And so that analysis is important to get there. And then we really just have to really truly just define what the risks are. What are the emergency risks associated with operating CalChoice? And to me, I think it would be more legislative, which we may be able to do an assessment in that case, as well as programmatic, meaning, which could be tied to legislation. The legislation comes down and says, you all must do this by X date. And then before we put it into the budget and build it into the rates, do we have cash on hand for the CalChoice team to actually administer and implement whatever may be required of us through any new legislation?
The other question I would have relating to reserves would be, this 1.8 is sitting there, and yes, there's cash flow needs and we need to be able to pay those invoices. But if you have 50 to 75% or 6 to 9 months of operating capital sitting there, how are we investing that? How is that growing? And what is done with those funds? And maybe that's a separate conversation also.
I can answer that question. So similar to what many of our CCAs have, there is an ICS account set up at River City Bank where we maintain between 40 and 50% of our cash balance in that fund. And then it earns interest equivalent to the life rate. That the 60 to 50 to 75% operating reserve was on the slide, the thought being if the board we have heard from certain board members, they're interested in looking at potential prepay transactions, prepay of energy transactions. And if that were to flow through CalChoice, and there's also been discussions of how do we optimize CalChoice, for the benefit of the members, and maybe CalChoice should pursue a credit rating. And if we were to do that, that's one of the metrics that's looked at very closely is days cash on hand and liquidity. And that's where that figure comes from. We certainly can operate with less. It's more thinking about the big picture in terms of, what does the future look like? And we have spoken to a rating agency, but we haven't really gone anywhere with those discussions at this point. It was just initial based on inquiries that have been expressed to us from members.
Right. And Barbara makes a really interesting point. A year ago or so, we looked at how to, as CalChoice, secure better security documents or better security instruments that would replace cash deposits for some of these transactions that we have. And when we went through that, the gentleman that we met with, he wanted us to 100% cover and secure said security instrument. And we were like, okay, well, that's misses the point. That's what we're trying not to do. And so in the event that we do have a balance sheet with CalChoice that would support some type of credit rating to where somebody would be willing to provide us at a significantly lower cost than making a cash deposit for security of these transactions, that would be better. And so that is another element I think we all need to consider. And I'm sorry, Barbara, you did include it on your slides and we have not gotten there. But yes, that's 100% another reason for us to consider maybe a significantly higher reserve amount than what we would need to satisfy potential risks. is how do we look on paper for the purpose of securing a credit rating? And I can tell you, after just completing a certificates of participation transaction for the city a year ago, the reserve structure contributed significantly to an upgrade for the city of Lancaster's bond issue that we just did. And so looking at having not just a percentage reserve, but an actual structure to it that where it's thoughtful and it makes sense and it addresses multiple types of risks is something that the S&P analysts provided he gave a lot of feedback in the final report in regards to that and how that led to an actual upgrade from our agency being an A minus rating to an A rating. So that it matters. So thank you for Barbara for putting that and including that. And so maybe let's look at the S&P metrics sheet that they put out and see what types of reserves or what level of reserves or cash on hand metrics they would like to see before they provide a rating. And it is really that simple. They may go into an agency and say, what is your cash on hand? What does your reserve policy say? What is your percentage compared to your annual operating expenditures? And then they will put a grade specifically on it based on those metrics. And so, yeah, that's maybe the third component that needs to be considered in looking at this. So I guess maybe the direction now is to maybe perform some of those calculations on the working capital, take a look at the S&P metrics. Really, let's kind of think through what potential risks there are, and that may be minimized as we go through the analysis, but still important because we don't want to have something actually happen and we're like, oh, we didn't think of that. But have that analysis performed and then maybe come back with a recommendation of what you would think the percentage should be. And if that percentage is below or above where we're at, then we work on making it a target to improve upon it by the end of the fiscal year or build it into next year. And if it is, if the amount that we have is satisfactory to that or above that, then we need to come back to the board and try to reconvene as to what to do with surplus funds. But yeah, maybe that's the direction so we can kind of put a bow on this and move forward. Are there any questions or comments to that?
I just think, as you mentioned, surplus funds, I think that should probably be addressed somewhere in this policy, regardless of whether we actually have them or not, just to ensure future clarification.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. Did you hear that, Barbara?
Yeah, and I did hear that, and I'm looking for some clarification on in surplus, like over and above the reserve amount.
So in the event that you write the budget and it yields a revenue surplus of expenditures and it's not needed to satisfy the reserve requirement,
Right.
in most cases, an adjustment to the rate that gets charged to the agencies is made with those funds. And that's future looking. In the event that you come back with your analysis and realize that it's not 1.8, it's 1.5, then maybe the reserve policy will or should define how those surplus funds are to be handled. So is it a credit, or do we maintain for until next budget cycle, or whatever we decide? But definition in the policy is what's being recommended.
Yes, and I will share or explain when we do prepare the budget to determine what the administrative services rate should be. We don't set the budget. We set the budget to be within or below what the administrative services rate is. I don't know that we've ever increased our rates for our members. In fact, over time, they've gone down from where they were originally. For example, in this year, after taking into account the rates and then the expenditures, there was a differential of $135,000. if we had adjusted the rates, it would have been very de minimis to each of the member agencies. 135,000 spread across the 8 member agencies based on loads would have, been a few dollars. Not that we aren't concerned about it, but we are conscientious in terms of making sure that we're developing a budget that is within, within our current rates and doesn't result in increased costs to our members.
Right, right. But I think maybe as a group or as a board, we can come up with a mutually beneficial use for the funds that in aggregate makes more sense to accomplish than dividing it up 8 ways and having it be fairly, minuscule or immaterial. And so maybe that the policy can just speak to, in the event there's surplus funds above and beyond the reserve requirement, all agencies agree to put it into special programming fund or something like that, that would make more sense in an aggregate amount as opposed to sending us all 25,000. So that'll get eaten up and, so maybe that's, or, you never know, there could be some staffing elements or there could be just something that's needed at the time that can be considered as a better, higher and better use to keep it within CalChoice as opposed to be redistributed out.
Yes, understood.
Okay. Are there any more comments from the group before direction has been finally provided? And we can probably expect a report back at the next board meeting, correct? Of the analysis?
Yes, if you'd like, we can either have another subcommittee meeting or we can bring back this information to the full board. It's the pleasure of the subcommittee, what you'd like.
What do you guys think?
Subcommittee for Pico Rivera.
Okay. Pomona? Would you like to have the results brought back to another subcommittee meeting or back to the board in its entirety?
Yeah, I gave it a thumbs up. Subcommittee.
Okay.
Subcommittee.
Subcommittee, okay. Makes sense. So Barbara, once you're ready, go ahead and send out and schedule a subsequent subcommittee meeting. And so we can actually formalize the final presentation that would be going back to the entire board prior to the next meeting.
Will do.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.
So go ahead. Okay, are there any other questions, concerns? Anything that was not brought up that that's relevant to the analysis being performed by the team?
I guess I'd just make one brief comment is it might be a good idea to have our CEO take a look at it before we see it at the next subcommittee.
And he's here.
Okay.
And
All right.
he's getting a thumbs up in the room. Yes.
Yeah, I think it would be a good idea. That's what a CEO should be doing.
Got it. Understood. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for your time. And we look forward, look out for those emails from Barbara and her team as to when the next meeting will be scheduled to review. And we will adjourn this subcommittee meeting until that date as to be determined by the CalChoice team. All right. Thank you. Meeting's adjourned.
You.